In the process of scripting a recent video, an idea came to mind. A short little look at what could happen when two different navies met. Not in combat or tactics or anything of that nature, but in food and how different this can be between fleets. Albeit less so in regard to the actual menus themselves, but more on the supply side. I'm certainly not tasting history, though I'll admit the idea of doing a deeper dive into this topic is interesting. But for today, we'll mostly just be looking at USS Saratoga, HMS Victorious, and HMS Illustrious, and more specifically, what happened to the diets of the sailors when they met up. Victorious had to work with American supplies, while Saratoga's crew, well, we'll get to that in a bit. First, let's start with Vicky. During early 1943, HMS Victorious spent some time in the Pacific with the United States Navy. This is a bit of a long story, and I'll link my video on that. But the important part for the moment is when Victorious arrived to the Solomons in May 1943. By this point, the ship was using as much American supplies as she was British. The aircraft were American, some of the equipment had been swapped for American equivalents. Even the uniforms were American pattern. This was to be expected, of course. She was operating on a very distant supply line, with the only British supplies being Australian in nature. That situation lent itself towards using whatever was available, and that meant American supplies. However, an underappreciated part of that problem was the food. Victorious could and would carry a ton of supplies, but those wouldn't last forever. At some point, the crew would work through what they had loaded, and then it would be time to resupply from American stocks. Some things ran out sooner than others, of course, mostly because it was something the British carrier couldn't restock from American supplies. At least not shipboard supplies. You see, shortly after arriving in New Caledonia on May 24th, 1943, Victorious's crew raided Australian stocks. Not for food, uniforms, or anything of that nature. No, they were hunting for Australian rum. The Royal Navy was a wet navy, as the terminology goes. Alcohol was an accepted part of the ration, something that applied to the Australians as well. The Americans, not so much. The United States Navy was a dry navy. You would certainly still have stills and other such things, but officially, the fleet had no beer, rum, or what have you. At least not aboard ships. It really shouldn't be a surprise that the crew of Victorious went hunting for Australian supplies. Nor should it be a surprise when we return to the topic of wet and dry navies later. For the moment, however, Victorious continued along. She spent her time in the South Pacific, mostly on training, as the Japanese were largely content to hold their ships back. There were the odd battles, certainly, but none involving Victorious. This did mean there was relatively little need to restock ammunition or the like. But the high tempo of training could and would use up other supplies, fuel and food chief among them. Which brings us to the second point for Victorious in today's video. During her operations with the American Navy, Victorious would also experience American underway replenishment. For the most part, that meant fuel. On July 12th, Victorious took on 3,270 tons of fuel, along with 30,283 gallons of aviation fuel and 625 gallons of lubrication oil. Those figures should be an indication of what even relatively low-tempo operations consume, especially the lubrication oil, which is something you don't think about in the same way as fuel, unless you happen to be a mechanic. On the other hand, it's not the important part for this particular video. That would be the food that Victorious took on at the same time. While I haven't found details on more typical food items, there is one that was brought up with the fuel. That being the 20 gallons of American Navy ice cream. Anyone who studied the Pacific War can probably tell you how important that was. The Navy even built dedicated ice cream barges. It may seem like a bit of a silly thing, but you underestimate crew morale at your own peril. If the British had their rum, the Americans had their ice cream. A treat to keep the spirits up far from home, and one that became something of an addiction, particularly for naval aviators, and the crews of destroyers who would be rewarded in ice cream for returning down pilots. Obviously, Victorious's crew were not immune to the temptation, and if anything, that 20 gallons is just a drop in the bucket of how much they would have used, as well as being a drop in the bucket of the food supplies as a whole. Outside that July 12th resupply, there's one other food item I can bring up. 8 days later, on July 20th, the carrier ran out of potatoes. Because of this, Saratoga loaded up an Avenger to resupply Victorious. The fittingly nicknamed Spud Express proceeded to land aboard with 800 pounds of dehydrated potatoes, as well as a cook who taught the British crew how to prepare them, resulting in no less than 4 tons of mashed potatoes. The crew was probably thoroughly sick of those by the time they used them all up. That said, those potatoes also round things off here. We'll leave Victorious and the Solomons behind and follow Saratoga to her other stint with a Royal Navy carrier, the older HMS Illustrious in the Indian Ocean of 1944. This time, there's really only one thing I want to bring up. Recall how I said we'd be returning to the wet and dry Navy divide? Well, that's here. Shortly after arriving in Ceylon on March 31st, 1944, Saratoga's pilots paid a visit to Illustrious. Exactly when this happened isn't clear, but it was around that time. And if what the book Fast Carriers cites is even close to reality, this social call turned into a truly legendary drunken bender. For context, Saratoga would have had an air group of around 80 aircraft at this point. Even if every single one of those pilots went over, the result is still impressive. In a wild college party kind of way, but still impressive. The wet Illustrious paid host to men from a dry ship, and those pilots took full advantage, hopefully alongside Illustrious's own aviators when you look at the numbers here, because, as the book puts it, Sarah's pilots and hopefully Illustrious's crew managed to down 700 bottles of beer, alongside 36 bottles each of whiskey and gin. Even if you assume we're talking all 80 or so of Sarah's pilots, along with Illustrious's own aviators, that's at most around 130 men. depending on how many aircraft Illustrious even had at the time. I don't drink, but I can only imagine the hangovers after that kind of night. They may have drunk the ship clean out of its alcohol stock. Either way, though, that drunken party brings us to the end of this video. Was that a short, silly thing to end on? Yeah. But it's also a classic example of when navies meet up and trade food. Or in this case, drinks. A good place to end a similarly short video, I think. Just something that came up when putting together a different video. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content. And I'll see you in the next one.